Film is a unique storytelling medium. In addition to elements such as themes, plot, and characters, film uses visual and audio cues to shape the spectator's experience. Elements of film cinematography, such as shot composition, color palettes, lighting, or camera movement, are used to set the tone and ultimately contribute to the storytelling of a film. For example, to emphasize a climactic scene, filmmakers can use a close-up shot of a character's face or set up dramatic lighting to emphasize the emotional tension of a scene. These techniques are commonly used in everything from cheesy rom-coms to multi-million blockbuster movies. But what is good film cinematography? Roger Deakins, an English cinematographer who has worked on movies with directors like the Coen brothers, says that people confuse pretty with good cinematography. There is good cinematography and bad cinematography, and then there's cinematography that is right for the movie. Wide sweeping shots of color-corrected, saturated, beautiful landscapes might be pretty to look at, but they should only be considered good shots if they effectively enhance the story and characters. One movie in particular is considered revolutionary in its use of cinematography to further visual storytelling. "2001: A Space Odyssey." 2001: A Space Odyssey tells the story of humanity, from its birth in prehistoric deserts to its ascension in a higher plane of being. The movie's themes are largely grand and abstract, telling a story of time, progress, and the evolution of humanity. 2001 has minimal dialogue and very few plot points spread out over almost 3 hours of space. Instead, Stanley Kubrick, who directed the movie, primarily uses visual storytelling to convey the movie's main story about the evolution of man. But should the cinematography in this movie be considered good? Tonally, 2001 is all over the place, in my opinion. From the dingy and muted nature documentary at the beginning, to the cool-toned, hyper-realistic science fiction middle, to the abstract, colorful, and surreal final minutes, each sequence feels like it could be part of an entirely different movie. However, I don't necessarily think that this is a bad thing. While this movie can be beautiful, ugly, overwhelming, or anywhere in between, each visual choice, shot composition, or color palette is relied upon heavily to communicate the story to the audience. So, how does 2001: A Space Odyssey tell a story via cinematography? Does it do so effectively? And can its cinematography actually be considered good? In this video essay, I will be exploring these questions by comparing and contrasting the visual choices at the beginning and the end of this movie, which I will refer to as the Dawn of Man sequence and the Jupiter sequence, respectively. Both of these sequences have no dialogue and communicate the story entirely visually. The beginning of 2001: A Space Odyssey follows the Dawn of Man. In this segment of the movie, there is no narration, no dialogue, nothing that would explicitly tell a viewer what is going on. Kubrick relies entirely on visual storytelling to convey the narrative. Tonally, the shots during the Dawn of Man resemble those of a nature documentary. Many long, wide shots establish the vast, empty terrain. Shots of the protagonists, the apes, are also from a distance. The camera is typically static, and the colors of the scenes that include the apes are largely muted browns and blues. These stylistic choices are what lend these scenes an impersonal, documentary feel, and are reflective of the state of evolution that humankind currently inhabits in the movie. These apes behave animalistically, scavenging for food and fighting over resources. The camera work effectively communicates that these creatures are at the bottom of the evolutionary ladder, and we should observe them merely as animals. However, the tone of the movie shifts slightly in this scene, where we begin to get our first close-up shots of the apes as they're huddled together at night. We see clear fear in this close-up shot of a mother's face, cradling her baby as wildcats yowl outside of their cave. Shifting the perspective of the viewer to a more personal one emphasizes that the apes feel emotion. We begin to feel the potential humanity in these creatures. This visual shift allows the viewers to project their own emotions onto these creatures, communicating the potential for them to make their way up the evolutionary ladder. On a closer level, shot composition and camera angle also play a huge role in the way the story is communicated to the viewer. Before the arrival of the black monolith that signifies the evolution of the apes into a higher order of being, we are either observing the apes at eye level or looking down on them. The background of these shots is primarily Earth, and the apes are in their most primitive state at the bottom of the evolutionary ladder. With the arrival of the monolith, both the apes' and viewers' perspectives shift. For the apes, as they explore the monolith, we get this POV shot. They are forced to look at the sky for the first time in the movie. The direction of upward, or perhaps simply away from the Earth, is synonymous with the humanity's desire and capacity for growth as it is propelled into its new stage of evolution. After this pivot point in the movie, the camera angles change to reflect the enlightened state of the apes. Directly after the monolith scene, we see the apes picking through bones. The camera angle is level. Suddenly the music swells, the ape picks up a bone and raises it high into the air, and the camera angle changes. Now the viewer is on the ground, looking up at the ape as it smashes the skeleton into pieces, backdropped by the sky. The contrasting composition of these shots is what communicates to the viewer that a transition has taken place. The apes have reached a higher order of evolution. These themes of upward and outward, reflecting humanity's evolution, are represented throughout the rest of the movie, as humans make it to the moon, then Jupiter, and finally ascend into another plane of existence. In contrast to the beginning of the movie, the last 15 minutes of 2001: A Space Odyssey have a much more abstract, disjointed, and surreal feel than everything preceding it. Dave, the protagonist that emerges in the third sequence of the movie, finally makes it to Jupiter, where he discovers another monolith and begins humanity's final stage of evolution from something human into something more than that. Here, the colors and shapes of the movie are abstract, and we get chaotic visuals interspersed by shots of Dave. What purpose does this dramatic shift serve? This constant movement and abstract color couldn't be further from the realistic, muted, and static feel of the Dawn of Man sequence. I believe that this tonal shift is meant to communicate the extent of evolution that Dave, and therefore mankind, is capable of experiencing. Initially, the camera shows Dave's entire face as the shuttle plunges through a strange, colorful dimension. However, as the scene continues, the colorful sequence is interspersed with extreme close-ups of Dave's eye, changing color with the scenery outside. These close-ups emphasize Dave's wide-open, unblinking eye. My guess is that this represents a sort of true sight, paralleling the first scene of the ape understanding tools and ascending into a higher order of being. Dave, representing humanity, finally sees what will bring humanity to a higher level, paralleling the realization of the ape with his bones during the Dawn of Man sequence. Rather than explicitly stating what that realization is, the crazy visuals, time distortion, and discordant music which underscore this scene communicate to the viewer that whatever realization Dave has come to, it's not immediately accessible to us as an audience. This sequence is as foreign and incomprehensible to us as the sudden appearance of a black monolith would have been to the apes at the start of the movie. And then we get another shift. At the end of the movie, Dave finds himself aging rapidly in a futuristic, Baroque-style room. Kubrick uses visual cues to distort both our sense of time and space during the scene. The editing cuts are non-continuous, showing Dave interacting with progressively older versions of himself. Kubrick also chooses to center the subject in many of these shots, a departure from the traditional rule of thirds, to build tension. This, along with the strange set, communicates to the viewer that we should feel uncomfortable. There's something unnatural going on here. Kubrick also uses a fisheye lens to distort the physical space that Dave finds himself in. In addition to contributing to the air of surrealness, this distortion may serve a second purpose, reflecting the type of video captured by surveillance cameras and suggesting that Dave is being watched. These techniques create a very different feel from the long, realistic, documentary-like atmosphere at the start of the film, and transition to something more surreal and difficult to understand. No longer does the cinematography convey a straightforward, realistic story of man discovering tools, a story that the viewer is already familiar with. Now there are things happening on screen that are not intuitive or immediately accessible to the viewer. We don't know this part of the story yet. We're not exactly sure what it means, but we want to find out. So, can the cinematography in 2001: A Space Odyssey be considered good? I think it goes beyond good. It's phenomenal. I mean, it has to be, with so little dialogue in the movie. From the general ambiance to the thoughtfulness of the camera placement in almost every scene, each visual choice helps to further underscore the narrative and contribute to the message of the film. Upon first glance, each section of a movie appears to clash tonally. However, this was done deliberately to reflect the scope of evolution that mankind experiences over its lifetime. If we define good cinematography as something that's not objectively beautiful, but the right choice for the movie and the story, then Kubrick definitely succeeds. He is able to convey major themes about time and the evolution of humanity through cinematography, and the final product does end up being beautiful after all.